today's lecture. Today we have chosen the subject of colonialism and environment. Colonialism is considered an environmental turning point in the history of India. An era of unprecedented resource exploitation begins and natural resources get geared to the requirements of the nascent English industries. The commercial interests come center stage and a large chunk of communities dependent on various resource use practices for their subsistence get marginalized. The twin processes of industrialization and colonization operate in tandem and bring in environmental impoverishment for India. The colonial power in this process is guided by its understanding of the environment of the colony, and the policy of resource use unfolds and becomes operational in consonance with this understanding. Let's first understand industrialism, the environmental perspective. Industrial revolution was a momentous occurrence. It signaled a break for the biological regimes and initiated a process of industrialization impregnated with enormous new possibilities for the use of natural resources. Technological advances with far-reaching impacts accompanied industrialization, and they together unleashed processes that altered completely the prevailing picture of the natural world. Fernand Braudel had said, in fact, until the 18th century, a jungle book could have been written about almost any part of the globe. Within a century since then, however, echoes of wailing voices could be heard saying, "How green was my valley?" England was a pioneer in industrialization. It was a special circumstance that had given England a position of eminence. Industrialization was a complex process initiated there due to a peculiar combination of factors. The major areas under the spurge of industrialization were agriculture, demography, inland transport, technology, trade, and industry. Agriculture provided the necessary backdrop against which the industrial change unfolded. Experiments with soil usage and the introduction of crop varieties were perhaps the first stage where notable changes became evident. Liming enhanced the fertilizing properties of soil, and marling the soil and a pattern of crop rotation was experimented with for rejuvenating the different layers of soil. It's an interesting fact that industrial and mechanized equipment in agriculture were introduced only around the mid-19th century. Braudel notes that change in agriculture come not so much from machines or wonder crops as from new methods of land use, new timetables for plowing, new forms of crop rotation which eliminated fallow and encouraged grazing, a useful source of fertilizer and therefore a remedy for soil exhaustion, attention to new strains of crops, selective breeding of sheep and cattle, specialized farming for higher yields, and with result which varied according to region, to natural conditions, and to constraints of the market, which were never the same in two places. The resulting system in the 19th century is called high farming. One of the first modifications in the industrial sector was the substitution of coke for charcoal as a fuel. The most visible application of coke was in blast furnaces for the production of pig iron. Around 1760, the cost of charcoal-fired smelting was roughly 2 pounds per ton higher than that of iron produced by the alternative method, coke-fired blast furnaces. Another notable shift occurred in the cotton industry, where a production boom began to emerge by the end of the 18th century. India was intimately involved here. Braudel reported that The cotton revolution, first in England, but very soon all over Europe, began to imitating Indian industry, went on to take revenge by catching up with it and finally outstripped it. The aim was to produce fabrics of comparable quality at cheaper prices. The only way to do so was to introduce machines which alone could effectively compete with Indian textile workers. Nevertheless, Arkwright's water frame and Crompton's mule made it possible to produce yarn as fine and strong as the Indian product, one that could be used for weaving fabric entirely out of cotton. The market for Indian cotton would be challenged by the developing English industry, and it was a very large market indeed, covering England and the British Isles, Europe, and the coast of Africa, where black slaves were exchanged for lengths of cotton, and the huge market of colonial America, not to mention Turkey and the Levant of India itself. Cotton was always produced primarily for export. In 1800, it represented a quarter of all British exports. By 1850, this had risen to 50%. An extraordinary expansion of English trade was one more feature of industrialization. After 1760, English overseas trade continuously increased. The center of gravity of this trade moved towards American colonies and India. The canal fever, as the development of navigable waterways is generally known, began in 1775, and by the 1830, wide and narrow canals had crisscrossed the entire country. The main intent was to facilitate the haulage of resources on a bulk scale so that the growth of English industries would not be stifled for want of natural resources in the proximity of the sites of the industries. In this context, it can be inferred that firstly, industrialization resulted in a good deal of destruction, adaptation, and restructuring. The traditional structures of agriculture were impaired and the land use patterns changed significantly. For instance, animal farming became more profitable than arable, making farmers shift to forage crops. Since forage crops do best on light and sandy soil, these became the most productive land in England. Heavy clay soils, by contrast, previously regarded as the richest for cereal growing and unsuitable for forage crops, were hit by the low prices created by higher yields in rival regions. Secondly, industrialism, that is the adaptation of an industrial mode of life, became the dominant special norm. In other words, this meant a transition from a predominantly agricultural society to one in which manufacturing dominated. The central discourse under industrialization was about the revolution in the mode of resource use, transforming resources from one form to another and making it possible for resources to be transported over large distances away from the places of their origin. A treatise mediated the environmental perception or understanding of the English colonizers. In the English understanding of environmental conditions in India in the 18th century, but especially since the Battle of Plassey, the following features were quite dominant. The natural resources of India needed to be elevated to the level of commercial use in place of the prevalent general practice of use for subsistence purposes. The resource use practices needed to become free of any restraints to enable resource exploitation. The community control over resources required to be freed. A conflict in the ways of life, or cultures was deemed inevitable in this process. Colonialism, environmental perspective. The colonization of India was an occurrence of singular significance. The largest colony in the world was created by the classic capitalist power. The long historical processes from about the middle of the 18th century till the beginning of the 20th century was apprehensive with devices of resource exploitation of an unprecedented kind, interceded by an environmental perception that oriented resources principally towards the market. Alfred Crosby has nicely elaborated the colonial discourse on the environment in his work Ecological Imperialism, the biological expansion of Europe. The consequence of colonial discourse on the environment is discussed as: European colonizers experimented native ecosystems and populations. The complex of weeds, animals, and diseases brought by Europeans devastated the flora, fauna, and human societies of the colonies, created new Europes that dominate the New World today. In the biological expansion of Europe, three areas were within reach but beyond grasp: the Middle East, China, and India. Population densities, resistance to disease, agricultural technology, and sophisticated socio-political organizations made these areas more resistant to the ecological imperialism of Europe. In the case of more ecologically resistant civilizations like India and China, a different strategy had to be adopted. In India, the British could not create neo-Europes by disseminating indigenous populations and their natural resource base, but they did intervene radically after existing food production systems and their ecological basis. Moreover, by exposing their subjects to the seductions of the industrial economy and consumer society, the British ensured that the process of ecological change they initiated would continue and indeed intensify after they left India's shores. The English colonial control of the India began within the acquisition of the power to collect land revenue to Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Irfan Habib describes the process and its meaning intricately, saying the East India Company, which obtained this power, was controlled by the great merchant capitalists of London. These merchants had so far conducted a trade based on the import of Indian piece goods, muslin, calico, chintz, silk, indigo, and spices that was financed mainly by the export of treasure. From these, the expenses necessary for maintaining government and army and law and order, the costs of maintenance of the existing system of exploitation had to be deducted to yield the net profits. These could in turn be invested for the purchase of Indian commodities, the so-called investments. The purchase of these commodities in conditions where the buyer had a monopoly and their sale in markets throughout the world further enlarged the profits before the tribute, a word freely in use for it at that time, was finally received in England. The revenues from the conquest dwarfed the amount of bullion that had once financed English trade, and accordingly the exports of Indian commodities underwent an enormous increase. British imports originating in East India increased from £1.5 million in 1750 to 1751 to £5.8 million in 1797 to 98, from 12% of total British imports to 24%. In contrast, British exports to East India rose only from 6.4% to 9% of total British exports. Interestingly, the profits so gained by the English did not come from commerce but were made available through the collection of land revenue. Great pressure was exerted on the farmers, peasants for maximizing the land revenue. The results were terrifying as agriculture was ruined. The colonial perception of the commercial use of resources had yielded disastrous results. During the period coinciding with the first half of the 19th century, the colonial objective changed from seizing Indian commodities to seizing the Indian market. The changed objective not only made the East India Company's monopoly over Indian internal commerce and overseas trade obsolete, but positively required free trade. The English exports of manufacturers and textiles in the first place not only practically wiped out the Indian exports of cotton goods, but also entered India to challenge Indian manufacturers in their home market. The result was a second disaster. The deindustrialization of India had been affected. About the mid-19th century, capital investment at home had reached a saturation point. This gave rise to an intensified race for markets and the export of capital. In India, this capital was used for laying railways. Once this process had progressed up to a certain stage, the influx of imports from England gained momentum. This onslaught of imports had grave consequences for the traditional craft and industries of India. They were ruined beyond repair. Such was the ecological environmental encounters between India and its colonial conquerors. That's the English. So let's talk about the conservation. It is generally argued that the age of discovery and associated maritime travel gave rise to a new way of looking at the man-nature relationship. There were two kinds of major changes involved in this new vision. The first is related to the emergence of a view that natural environment surrounding human society was pliable to man's desired change. The second gave rise to a new kind of significance being attached to nature that also often imitated. The development of the idea of botanical garden was copied from the Middle East. In 17th century, a fundamental displacement of social and symbolic meanings away from the confines of religious contexts and into more secular settings takes place. Soon, the idea of flood and fall natural world in opposition to a spiritual heaven became less attractive as the whole globe became technically and economically more reachable, and as its extraordinary variety and richness, especially in tropical regions, became apparent and knowledge of it more widely disseminated in printed books. The conservation efforts initiated in the colonies were the result of a keen awareness that had developed about an impending global scarcity of timber resources. Nonetheless, none of these efforts could be linked directly to any methodical effort at organizing the resource use practices in the colonies to the objective of a conservation. A serious threat to the supply of naval timber was the initial impetus for conservation. In the absence of any institutional evolution, thus the environments of colonies continued to suffer. Richard H. Grew writes that the early incorporation of conservationism as an accepted part of the role of the colonial state in India needs to be set in a broader context. There is no doubt that environmental sensibilities in Britain, for example, were among some groups almost as well developed by the 1860s as they were among the scientific services in India. They were very different kinds of sensibilities and were associated with different kinds of social critique. The biota of Europe was simply not perceived as being threatened by rapid ecological change of the kind that was taking place in India. As a result, embryonic worries about the destruction of natural landscape and species extinctions remained the concern of a largely ineffective minority. It's not unfair to assume that environmental conservation as a policy was not on the principal agenda of the colonialists. Dear students, the process of industrialization and the necessity to control the resources available in the colonies influenced the colonial understanding of the environment. The emphasis on the use of natural resources as commodities was the main aspect of this understanding. Local coherent communities that had previously been nourished by the natural resources were pushed to the margins, and atomized people took their place. Individual access to resources rather than collective access was pushed as a key result of this. The natural resources were now oriented towards the market, and the subsistence resources use pattern was significantly damaged. Conservation practices that consider the entire environment were not popular. India, as a colony, was seen as a repository of natural resources, the exploitation of which was seen as a legitimate right. With this, today's topic comes to its conclusion. Hope you have understood the content. We'll further work for improvising your memory and learning. See you in next session. Till then, good luck and goodbye.